Daniel was on another one of his walks in the forest when suddenly a striking and beautiful plant caught his eye. It looked like a mushroom, but he had never seen anything like it before. He decided to bring it home with him, where he would take a better look at it. However, he had no idea that this seemingly small and simple action would lead to his entire street being sealed off the next day. And that wouldn't even be the worst that would happen to him. The autumn sun was shining high as Daniel was walking through the forest, collecting various plants that he wanted to bring home. He couldn't wait to show his wife, Christy, the extraordinary mushroom that he had just found. It looked very strange, but that was exactly the reason why it had caught his eye. In the forest, he had also found some more edible plants and fruits like wild strawberries and blackberries that they could use in the kitchen. But he had no idea if this mushroom was edible at all. He made his way back home with a basket filled to the brim, excited to find out more about it, and unaware of the chaos that would ensue. When he came home, Christy was busy in their vegetable garden. "Hey, Chris, you have to see what I found today. Check this out," Daniel said, as he placed the basket on the ground next to her and opened it to take out the mushroom. When she finally saw it, she gasped with surprise. "Wow, it's beautiful!" she exclaimed. "I know, right? I just couldn't leave it there. The only thing is, I have no idea what kind of mushroom this is. I don't even know if it's safe to eat. Do you have any idea?" he asked her. However, Christy shook her head and told him that she, too, had never seen anything like it before. "Daddy, what is that thing?" his daughter Maya asked. Her eyes were wide as she closely inspected the mushroom in front of her. "Can we eat it?" Daniel told her. "No, honey, not yet. Not until we find out if it is safe to eat it." They were on a mission, and they were determined to find out more about this special mushroom. They tried to look it up online, but they simply could not find any information about this specific mushroom. It was already getting late and time for bed, so they decided to take a photo of it and post it on an online forum. Hopefully, someone there would be able to tell them more about it. However, when they woke up the next morning, they heard a lot of commotion on the street outside. They had left the window open, and they heard many people talking very loudly, almost even screaming. Christy got up from the bed and walked over to the window to take a look, and she was surprised to see the entire street was sealed off. It was complete chaos out there, and she recognized some of their neighbors talking to police officers. "Police officers? Why are they here? What's going on?" she exclaimed. "Daniel, get up here. You have to see this," she urged him. He was still very sleepy, but as soon as he saw what was going on out there, he was shocked and wide awake. "Oh, wow, that can't be good," he said, when he saw that the street was closed off. Being the curious person that he was, he got dressed and quickly walked down the stairs and out the front door, wanting to figure out what was happening. Nothing interesting ever happened in their neighborhood, so he was almost kind of excited to hear the current gossip. However, everything changed as soon as he opened the door. "There, that's him," someone yelled while pointing a finger at Daniel. A police officer approached him and asked, "Are you Daniel Roberts?" To which he replied, "Yes, that's me." Before he even realized what was going on, the officer had handcuffed him. "You're going to have to come with me." "What? You're making a mistake," Daniel said, almost laughing. It was obvious that whatever they were looking for, he was not involved in it. Or at least, that's what he thought. In reality, he was exactly the person who they were looking for. "No mistakes here," the officer told him. And then, it began to become clear to Daniel that he was in trouble. The officer led Daniel into a police car and told him, "Wait here. We'll drive you to the station in just a few minutes." Daniel was shocked. Why would they need him at the police station? He noticed that his neighbors were looking at him with a very angry expression, and he did not understand what he'd done wrong. However, he'd find out soon enough. He suddenly saw Christy and Maya running toward the car, and once they got there, Christy started knocking on the window. "Daniel, what is going on? Where are they taking you?" she yelled, panicking and in tears. "Officer, you have to tell me what is going on. He hasn't done anything wrong," she exclaimed, tears streaming down her face. "Miss, please, step away from the car. Daniel can call you after we're done interrogating him," an officer responded, his voice very calm and serious. Before Christy even had the chance to reply, the officer had already gotten behind the wheel and started the car. There was nothing she could do but wait. She looked around and noticed that the street was empty, and she was left all alone. Daniel's heart broke as the car drove away, and he saw his wife and daughter, left all alone in the middle of the street, worried and helpless. It was funny how he was the one being taken away in a police car, but he was still more worried about them than himself, he thought. He really loved them, and he was determined to go back home to them no matter what. He just had to. When they arrived at the police station, Daniel was brought to an interrogation room. The officers told him, "Wait here. Someone will be with you shortly," before leaving the room and locking the door behind them, making sure that he could not get away. Daniel thought about the best way to approach this whole situation, and he decided that he was going to cooperate. It was the best way of showing them that he was innocent. Only minutes later, a woman dressed in a suit entered the room, followed by the officer who had cuffed Daniel earlier. "Good morning, Daniel. I am Detective Jacobs. This is my colleague, Officer Williams. I have a couple of questions to ask you, if you don't mind." Daniel nodded, saying, "Sure, no problem. I don't know what it is you think I have done, but I will happily answer all of your questions if it can help me prove my innocence." "I wouldn't be so sure about that just yet," the detective told him with a smug look on her face. Daniel didn't really like this attitude, but he still had no idea what he was being interrogated about. "Well, what do you want to know?" he asked, wanting to get on with it. The sooner he proved he hadn't done anything, the sooner he could go back home. The detective sighed and then asked, "Daniel, where were you yesterday?" He answered her question honestly, hoping that this would clear some things up. "Whatever it is you think I have done, it's not true. I have been in the forest all day." But he didn't know that that was exactly what the detective was hoping to hear. However, before she could ask the next question, the door opened and a man in a long white lab coat appeared. "Detective, do you have a moment?" he asked. Detective Jacobs left the room and returned only a minute later, telling her colleague, "Get him into a cell. I have to take care of some business first." Whatever it was, it appeared to be very urgent. But Daniel was shocked, and he exclaimed, "What are you talking about, a cell? No, I refuse." However, his plan wasn't working, and minutes later, he found himself behind locked bars. The cold, hard floor of the cell pressed against Daniel's back as he tried to find a comfortable position. The walls seemed to close in on him, their gray, unyielding surfaces reflecting his growing despair. He felt a weight in his chest, a heaviness that made it hard to breathe. The reality of his situation began to sink in. Alone, isolated, and with no understanding of why he was there, the hours felt like days. The silence was oppressive. Every small sound, from the distant footsteps to the occasional drip of water, was magnified in the void of noise. Daniel's own breathing seemed loud in his ears, a constant reminder of his isolation. He tried to call out, to shout for someone, anyone, but his voice only returned as an echo, amplifying his anxiety and deepening his sense of loneliness. Lying on the cold floor, Daniel's mind wandered to happier times. He remembered the sun filtering through the trees, the sound of leaves crunching underfoot, and the joy of discovering new plants in the forest. He thought of Christie's laughter and Maya's curious eyes as they explored nature together. Those memories, so vivid and yet so distant, were a stark contrast to the bleakness of his current surroundings. As the hours dragged on, Daniel clung to the hope that someone would come. Every footstep he heard outside his cell door made his heart race in anticipation. Maybe it was a guard with news or even Detective Jacobs with answers. He listened intently, hoping for a voice, a clue, anything to break the monotony and give him a glimmer of hope. The dim light filtering through the small window in his cell began to fade, signaling the approach of night. Daniel had no way of telling time, but the encroaching darkness made it clear that he had been in the cell for hours. The night stretched on, each moment feeling longer than the last. With no sign of anyone coming for him, despair threatened to consume him, and he wondered if the dawn would ever come. The first rays of sunlight had barely touched the horizon when the sound of footsteps approached Daniel's cell. The metallic rattle of keys preceded the appearance of an officer, his face unreadable. "Mr. Roberts," he began, his voice echoing in the cold chamber. "There have been developments. We need to talk." The officer's words were measured but carried a weight of urgency. "Your family," he hesitated, searching for the right words. "They've been placed in quarantine. There's concern about potential exposure." Daniel's heart raced. "Exposure? To what?" The officer continued. "You'll be moved too, for everyone's safety." Panic gripped Daniel. "Wait! I need to speak to them. Are they okay? Christie? Maya?" His voice cracked with desperation. The officer's eyes softened momentarily, revealing a hint of sympathy. "I'm just following orders, Mr. Roberts. You'll be briefed soon." But Daniel's pleas grew more frantic, his need to connect with his family overpowering. The process was swift. 2 officers escorted Daniel down a series of sterile hallways. The surroundings changed from the cold, gray bricks of his initial cell to a more modern, clinical setting. They stopped in front of a sealed door labeled "Quarantine." As the door hissed open, Daniel was met with a room that looked more like a medical facility than a cell. Inside, the weight of uncertainty pressed down on Daniel. The room was equipped with a bed, a table, and medical instruments. A large window, likely one way, dominated one wall. He felt like a specimen under observation. The unknowns multiplied in his mind. Why was his family quarantined? What had they been exposed to? And most importantly, would they be okay? The questions consumed him, amplifying his fear and confusion. The door to Daniel's quarantine room opened with a soft hiss, revealing Detective Jacobs. Her face was stern, and her eyes focused intently on Daniel. "Mr. Roberts," she began, her voice firm, "we need to discuss the mushroom you found." Daniel's heart raced. He had hoped for answers, but the gravity in her tone made him uneasy. Detective Jacobs placed a sealed bag on the table. Inside was the mushroom, its unique appearance even more striking up close. "This," she began, "is not just any mushroom. It's rare, and its properties are concerning." Daniel frowned, trying to grasp her meaning. "It's not native to our region, and its presence here raises many questions." The detective continued. "Your discovery has set off a chain of events. Various agencies are now involved, and there's a scramble to understand how and why this mushroom is here." Daniel felt a sinking feeling. "I just thought it was unique," he whispered. Jacobs nodded. "And that's the problem. Its uniqueness is what's causing the alarm." Daniel's mind raced. He thought back to the day in the forest, the thrill of finding the mushroom and the innocent intent of sharing it online. He never imagined the chaos it would cause. "I didn't know," he murmured, his voice heavy with regret. Detective Jacobs sighed. "Sometimes, Mr. Roberts, the smallest actions have the most unforeseen consequences." Detective Jacobs leaned in, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "This isn't just about a mushroom, Daniel. It's about ecological balance, potential threats, and the safety of our community." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. "Your discovery has opened a door to a much larger issue, one that we're only beginning to understand." As Daniel tried to process the detective's words, a sudden uncomfortable itch on his hand distracted him. Glancing down, his heart skipped a beat. Red spots, previously unnoticed, now marred his skin in an alarming pattern. They weren't there before, were they? Panic welled up as he frantically inspected both hands, the reality of the situation becoming terrifyingly clear. This was something he hadn't anticipated. Detective Jacobs, noticing Daniel's growing distress, spoke up with urgency. "Your family noticed similar symptoms earlier. Christy and Maya are deeply worried, especially for you." Daniel's eyes widened in horror, his mind racing. "Are they okay? Are these spots dangerous?" The detective's face softened, revealing a hint of empathy amidst the professional demeanor. Their health was now a top priority. Hours turned into days, and the red spots on Daniel's hands began to spread at an alarming rate. They crept up his arms, accompanied by a burning sensation that made it hard to focus on anything else. Every time he looked, it seemed the rash had progressed further, a constant, unnerving reminder of the unknown threat he faced. The uncertainty was maddening. Despite his own growing discomfort, Daniel's thoughts constantly drifted to Christy and Maya. Were they experiencing the same painful symptoms? Were they in pain or distress? The thought of his family suffering, possibly because of his actions, was unbearable. He felt trapped, desperate to be with them, to protect and comfort them. The weight of responsibility pressed heavily on him. Seeing Daniel's visible anguish, Detective Jacobs approached him with a sense of purpose. "Listen, Daniel," she began, her voice softer than he'd heard before. "We have top medical professionals working diligently on this. Your family is in good hands, and we're doing everything we can to understand and treat these symptoms swiftly." She paused, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "We'll get through this together." In the sterile confines of the quarantine cell, Daniel paced restlessly. Each tick of the unseen clock amplified his anxiety. He strained his ears for any hint of movement outside, any whisper that might bring news. But all he was met with was silence. The isolation gnawed at him, making every second feel like an eternity as he yearned for updates. Sitting on the edge of the bed, Daniel's mind replayed that day in the forest. The joy of discovery, the pride in showing Christy and Maya, now seemed so naive. If only he'd left the mushroom untouched. If only he'd been more cautious. The weight of his choices pressed down on him, filling the room with palpable remorse and self-reproach. Emotions swirled within Daniel like a tempest. One moment, he clung to the hope that everything would be resolved, that his family was safe. The next, despair threatened to drown him, pulling him into a vortex of fear and uncertainty. The roller coaster of feelings left him drained, teetering between optimism and overwhelming dread. The room seemed to close in on Daniel. The same four walls, the same ceiling, the same floor. Time lost meaning. Hours? Days? He couldn't tell. The stillness was maddening, punctuated only by his own restless movements and the distant hum of the facility. The wait was a torment, a test of his patience and resilience. Just when the weight of the situation seemed unbearable, a murmur reached Daniel's ears. Voices outside his door spoke of a potential breakthrough. Though muffled, the tone was unmistakably optimistic. Hope surged within him, a beacon in the darkness. Could there be a solution on the horizon? The mere possibility rekindled his spirit, offering a lifeline in his sea of uncertainty. The initial discomfort in Daniel's hands slowly transformed into a more sinister sensation. The red spots, once merely alarming in appearance, now throbbed with a dull, persistent ache. Each movement, every flex of his fingers, seemed to exacerbate the pain. The reality of his situation became even more daunting as the physical symptoms began their cruel dance. As hours passed, the dull ache evolved into a searing burn. It felt as though his hands were held against a flame, the skin being scorched from within. Desperation gripped him. He tried to soothe the burn with cool air, rubbing his hands together, but nothing alleviated the torment. The pain was relentless, consuming every thought and overshadowing all else. Unable to bear the agony any longer, Daniel's voice echoed through the quarantine cell. "Help! Please! Someone! Help me!" he cried out, his voice laced with pain and desperation. He banged on the door, hoping to draw attention, praying for some relief, any respite from the unyielding torment that held him captive. But the response was a deafening silence. The thick walls of the quarantine cell seemed to swallow his pleas, leaving him in a void of isolation. The distant hum of the facility continued, indifferent to his suffering. The realization that no immediate help was coming was a fresh blow, adding a layer of emotional pain to his physical torment. The hours that followed were a blur of anguish. The burning sensation reached a crescendo, feeling as though molten lava coursed through his veins. Every nerve ending in his hands screamed in protest. Daniel's mind teetered on the brink of despair, the intensity of the pain threatening to shatter his resolve. It was a test of endurance, a battle against an invisible enemy. In the midst of his agony, a spark of determination ignited within Daniel. If no one was coming to help, he'd have to help himself. He began to study his surroundings meticulously, searching for any weakness, any oversight that might provide a means of escape. The pain was a constant distraction, but his desperation fueled his resolve to find a way out. Spotting a loose vent cover, Daniel saw his chance. With trembling hands, he worked to pry it open, hoping it might lead to a way out. Every second was a gamble, knowing that getting caught would only worsen his situation. But the thought of freedom, of relief from his pain, drove him forward, pushing him to take the risk. Just as he was making progress, the unmistakable sound of footsteps approached. Panic surged as the door swung open, revealing a pair of guards. They quickly apprehended him, his escape plan crumbling before his eyes. The brief glimmer of hope was extinguished, replaced by a sinking feeling of despair and defeat. Dragged from his cell, Daniel was met with stern faces and harsh reprimands. "You could have made things worse for yourself," one guard admonished. They didn't seem to understand or care about his pain, only the breach of protocol. As they lectured him on the dangers of his actions, Daniel felt even more isolated, the weight of his situation pressing down harder than ever. The guards returned him to a different cell, one even more secure than the last. The door slammed shut with a finality that echoed in Daniel's ears. Alone once more, he felt the walls of confinement closing in. The failed escape attempt had only deepened his sense of hopelessness, leaving him to wonder if he'd ever find a way out of this nightmare. The familiar sound of Detective Jacobs' footsteps echoed outside Daniel's cell. The door opened, revealing her stern face, but this time there was a hint of optimism in her eyes. "Mr. Roberts," she began, her tone more gentle than before, "we might have some good news for you." Daniel, weary and desperate for relief, clung to her every word. From her pocket, Jacobs produced a small jar filled with a creamy substance. "This," she explained, "is an experimental ointment developed specifically for your condition." She handed it to him, instructing him to apply it liberally to the affected areas. Daniel, though skeptical, was willing to try anything that promised relief from his torment. As he applied the ointment, a cooling sensation immediately washed over his hands. The burning, which had been relentless, began to subside. Hours turned into days, and with each application, the red spots faded, and the pain diminished. Hope, which had been a distant memory, began to bloom in Daniel's heart once more. With the worst of his symptoms behind him, Daniel's strength and spirit began to return. The ointment, it seemed, was working wonders. He could move his hands without pain, and the redness had nearly disappeared. Gratitude filled him, not just for the cure, but for the second chance at health and normalcy. As Daniel's condition improved, Detective Jacobs returned to her line of questioning. "Now that you're feeling better," she began, setting aside the medical concerns, "we need to discuss the events leading up to this." Daniel braced himself, ready to recount the fateful day in the forest and hoping to finally clear his name. Detective Jacobs slid a printed screenshot across the table. It was Daniel's online post of the mushroom. "This," she began, her voice firm, "is what started it all." Daniel recognized the image immediately, his heart sinking. "After you posted this, alarms were raised. That mushroom is not just any mushroom," she continued, her gaze unwavering. She leaned in, explaining, "This particular mushroom is known to be highly poisonous. Moreover, it's not native to this region. It shouldn't be growing here." Daniel's confusion deepened. "Its presence here is a mystery, and its discovery has raised many concerns," Jacobs added, emphasizing the gravity of the situation. "Given its rarity and the dangers associated with it, the police initially thought you might have obtained it illegally," Jacobs said, her tone accusatory. Daniel's shock was palpable. "I just found it in the forest," he protested. "I had no idea about its significance." Jacobs nodded. "That's what we're trying to ascertain." After days of investigation, the police were able to verify Daniel's account. Surveillance footage from forest cameras confirmed his innocent discovery. "It seems you were just in the wrong place at the wrong time," Jacobs admitted, her demeanor softening. "We've found no evidence to suggest any wrongdoing on your part." The next morning, an officer entered Daniel's cell with a stack of papers. "Your release documents," he announced. Relief washed over Daniel. The ordeal was finally coming to an end. As he signed the papers, he couldn't help but think of the forest, the mushroom, and the unexpected chaos that one simple discovery had wrought. Stepping out into the daylight, Daniel was met with the sight he had longed for: Christy and Maya, waiting anxiously. They rushed towards him, their embrace warm and tight, a tangible relief from the cold isolation of the past days. Tears flowed freely, not just from relief, but from the profound gratitude of being together once more. Later, as they settled at home, Christy shared what she had learned. "The mushroom you found," she began, "was a mutated variant. While still poisonous, It's not as lethal as the original species. Daniel sighed in relief. His innocent discovery had indeed caused chaos, but the mutation had, in a way, shown mercy by being less toxic than its notorious counterpart. Gathered around the dinner table, the family reflected on their harrowing experience. Maya, with a wisdom beyond her years, remarked, "Nature has its own way of teaching us lessons." Daniel nodded. "We must always approach it with respect and caution." Christie added, "Every plant, every creature has its place and purpose. We just need to tread carefully." Weeks later, the family decided to revisit the forest, but this time there was a palpable caution in their steps. They walked with a heightened awareness, respecting boundaries and refraining from picking anything. The forest, with its myriad mysteries, welcomed them back, but the memories of their ordeal served as a constant, vigilant reminder. As they walked, Daniel mused aloud, "Nature has its own language, its own wisdom." Christie agreed, "It's a delicate balance, and we're just a small part of it." Maya, holding her parents' hands, looked up at the towering trees. "We need to listen more, learn more, and always remember the lessons it teaches us." The forest, in its silent majesty, seemed to nod in agreement.